It is December 1st, 2021. My name is Emma Magger. I'm with the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, and I'm speaking with David Woll today. So let's start with where you were born and where you live now.
Sure. I was born in Olney, Illinois, O-L-N-E-Y, Illinois. It instantly happens to be the home of the white squirrels because albino squirrels were unique to Olney, Illinois, and that's where I was born. Although I was raised in Lawrenceville the first 5 years of my life because there was no hospital in Lawrenceville at the time of 1948. So I was born actually in a sanitarium, which probably reflects my attitude and personality today.
So you lived in
and then now I currently live in Indianapolis, actually in Carmel, Indiana.
Okay. Excellent. So what is a memory from your early childhood? Were you born into a Jewish community? Was that a part of your identity growing up?
In the late years of 1940s and early years of 1950, I was raised in a Jewish family. My grandparents were next door neighbors to my parents, and they were Henry and Frida Loeb, of which I've done a profile and which is at the Indiana Historical Society archives. And it was, yes, my parents were conservative. My grandparents were probably conservative to Orthodox. And one of the reasons to which we left Lawrenceville, Illinois, and moved to Evansville was primarily because there was a larger Jewish population in Evansville, Indiana, than there was in Lawrenceville, Illinois.
All right. So at what point did you move again? Like, what was the year? And then did you move specifically into a Jewish neighborhood, or can you just expand on that a little bit, the community in Evansville?
Sure. At the peak of its Jewish population, Evansville had about 4 or 5 congregations.
Oh, wow.
Either conservative or reformed. Currently, it has one congregation with less than 100 families, and it's typical of the demographic changes of the Jewish communities across the country, in that Jews continue to basically move to bigger and bigger communities. And so Evansville had a very flourishing Jewish community in the early 20th century, and it has diminished to almost nothing since then. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, what are like some specific memories you have growing up there?
Sure. Excuse me just a second. I got my dogs that want to come in.
Aw.
They like watching it. They're King Charles. All right, everybody's in. They like interviews. Okay.
Oh, that's excellent. The more the merrier.
Sure. Come on, Bacall. Come here. You won't have to edit it. Come here. That's Bacall.
Oh, how
I don't
adorable.
Think. Are you Jewish? No. She grew up in an Amish family. Okay.
Oh.
All right. In southern Indiana too.
Right.
Yeah, there were there were a lot of good memories. Evansville at the time was a very, very good community to raise children. And my children were subsequently raised in Evansville, and I did 2 trips back to Evansville, which I may explain later. But my own raise in Evansville was interesting from a couple of perspectives. Number one, there was still a great deal of anti-Semitism in the community. Jews were not allowed to join certain country clubs. They were not allowed to join certain organizations like the Junior League or the Philharmonic. And there were covenants running running across the property, which prohibited Jewish families from living in certain sections of Evansville at the time. So, for example, in one exclusive neighborhood to which my father wanted to build a new home for me, my two sisters, and my mother, he was prohibited of doing that because they would not allow any Jews to basically own property in that particular area of Evansville on the Near East Side.
Wow.
I kind of bridged the two parts, two land masses, really. I understood anti-Semitism. I really wasn't subjected to it because if you were Jewish, you were kind of unique in Evansville to the extent that there were very few Jewish affluent families who lived there, and you were accepted on the basis that you were a token. And the non-Jewish community basically accepted my family on the basis that we were token Jews, and subsequently my father was on any number of different boards and organizations, and subsequently I was as well. I just didn't frankly realize the subtlety of the community until later in life.
Mhm. Very interesting. What business was your father in?
My father was in the oil business. He was a chemical engineer, graduate of MIT in Boston. And he came out to Boston to work at a chemical factory in Terre Haute, and subsequently was introduced to his future wife by the FBI agent in Evansville, who was not Jewish, and she was living in Lawrenceville at the time, and came from a very, very wealthy family who was involved in the scrap and the oil business in Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky.
Well, so your mother was not Jewish?
My mother was Jewish, yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It was the person that introduced them that was not, okay.
Yeah, my mother was more religious than actually my father was. My father was, he grew up in a community that wasn't particularly ritualistic.
Okay.
On the other hand, my mother grew up in a family that her father, or my grandfather, this is on the maternal side, was actually had very little formal education, but on the other hand, was very fluent in Yiddish and Hebrew and Torah and various ritualistic events in his life and in his family's life.
So after your family moved to Evansville, you said that you were also involved in boards as kind of the token person. Did you ever leave Evansville and come back?
Well, what I did was, yeah, I went to actually the first time after I graduated from school in New York City, I came to Indianapolis. I had a mentor who was running for lieutenant governor, and I went on his staff after he successfully ran and ultimately won. And I was probably at the time, I would guess, was probably the highest Indiana official who just happened to be Jewish at the time.
What year was that?
That was in 1970, in 1972, and he took office in 73. In fact, at one point in time, I looked at running in the 8th congressional district, which was a southern congressional district in Indiana, and I realized that being Jewish and a Republican did not bode well for me at the time, and still wouldn't today. And I chose not to run for Congress in southern Indiana. There was one other gentleman who was a friend of mine, Max Nelson. He ran in the would have been the Central Congressional District, Indianapolis environs, but he ran as a Democrat. And in retrospect, I probably should have run as a Democrat, but unfortunately, the 8th district in southwestern Indiana is heavily conservative and heavily Republican. And so that would have closed out my options as running as a Democrat candidate. Interestingly enough, my political mentor, the Lieutenant Governor Bob Orr, was an extremely moderate Republican at the time when the Republican Party had moderates in its in the party itself.
So you were in Indianapolis for that point.
Yes.
And then decided to return back.
And then I returned back because my mother had developed at the time, this is in the early 80s, had developed lung cancer, which was fatal. And I helped my father in a number of family businesses, including the oil business. And we were also farmers who incidentally raised heifers and Angus, and also a few pigs here and there too.
Wow, so you guys are really involved in the whole spectrum of business.
Yeah, we really were. My father was very highly educated. My mother wasn't. And his father-in-law, or my mother's father, was just a hardtack business person who had immigrated from Europe for many of the reasons that Jews immigrated in the early 19th or early 20th century, because of pogroms in Russia and Hungary, as well as the inability to really to raise himself economically or financially. So what he did was he immigrated to the States, and he's basically a historical story in starting in the sweatshops, garment factories of Lower East Side of New York City, and becoming a major force in the Illinois Basin in terms of development of oil, as well as he was a very large scrap dealer as well. In fact, the scrap dealer part of his business really translated in oil, because some of the wells were still producing. Those oil wells which didn't produce, he basically scrapped out the metal, sold it, and then focused on the production in a particular oil field that he was looking at. He came in contact with a lot of names that you'll recognize. John D. Rockefeller, and he traded Harry Sinclair, Sinclair Oil, which is gone, and probably several other people that you and most of us would recognize him. And this was when he was basically a scrap dealer.
Wow, and what was his name?
Henry Loeb, Loeb.
Henry Loeb. Okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, very resourceful. Lots of connections there.
I think he had to. He had to have his wits about him, because he came to a new land, America. He ended up really not knowing many people here, like a lot of Jewish immigrants, and consequently, he made his way here. His first wife died in childbirth, which in Europe, which was not unusual. His second wife came from the same village that he was raised but not until he was here. And then subsequently, he brought his entire family here over the years. And the family trips to the United States and their permanent residency was basically a barometer or indicator of how financially successful he was, because at the beginning he couldn't afford to bring the entire family here. But as he prospered, he brought more and more family members to the United States, because he had the ability, the financial ability to do that.
Yeah. Wow. It's interesting how that all the indicators you can look back and figure out someone's story through that.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is. Uh, in fact, the observation I have, and you may or may not get to, is I basically spend most of my time raising money, fundraising, and involved with entrepreneurial activities. And he, in a sense, historically in the 20th century, was involved in oil, okay, in the discovery of oil, and basically the scrapping of oil field equipment. And I've learned that raising money in the entrepreneurial world is getting tougher and tougher, and you have to be more resourceful. So I guess that's probably my answer to what my family would be doing that I'm doing right now in the 21st century. In fact, this year marks the 100th anniversary thereabouts of my grandparents' parents, and my involvement in the oil industry in the Illinois Basin, which consists of Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana.
Yeah, that's fantastic. 100 years.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of businesses that last that long.
No, that's really something to be proud of.
It's going to be interesting to see whether the next generation carries that on. And I suspect that they won't, other than they'll be passive investors in oil properties that they'll ultimately inherit from me.
So you mentioned you're an attorney. Has that, with your entrepreneurial ventures, have both been present in your life throughout your professional career?
Yes, I'm an attorney, but I really didn't go to law school for the purpose of practicing.
Okay.
And what I do, is really has all kinds of legal ramifications. Whether it's looking at oil and gas lease or a division order in the oil business, or looking at a contract or lease or a term sheet in the entrepreneurial world, I still have fortunately learned all the basic skills that I basically secured, going to law school. And what I did was I went to law school at night in Indianapolis. And worked in the state house during the day. So I had the best of, frankly, the best of both worlds. And after 4 years, graduated law school, passed the bar, fortunately on the first time. And I've used it. I've represented a few clients from time to time. I don't anymore because I basically spend my time with business investments as well as the oil and gas business, as well as the entrepreneurial business, which I've developed over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Wow. Great to have that experience and be able to be involved in both worlds.
Yeah, it's a it really is a treat, because what I found, because of my parents' affluence, universities and colleges, it didn't matter what the costs were, like they were today. I've figured it out that probably I have an education in today's dollars would be worth $1 million. And very few American families can afford to send their daughters and sons to institutions over the course, or multiple institutions over the course of years, and pay that kind of money. So I'm really fortunate in that extent, or to that extent.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you raised your family in Evansville. Can you talk about that a little bit, the experience of coming back and being the person in charge of your family in that community?
Sure. The first son was born actually in Evansville. The second one was born in Indianapolis.
Okay.
They had a good life in growing up in Evansville, but no surprise that they both moved to metropolitan area of New York City.
Oh my.
And I'll tell you why. They appreciated and understood the small community of Evansville, but they just wanted basically to escape to a larger community and to look at more opportunities. I think from a couple of standpoints, they were fortunate. Number one, I came from a family that was very prominent in Evansville.
Yeah.
Number two, they had all kinds of choices because of that.
Mhm.
I think there are segments of the Jewish community that resented my family, quite frankly, because
Really?
of our acceptance in the non-Jewish community.
Okay.
Okay, my kids only incurred anti-Semitism once when they were going to school, and that was quelled immediately, and I anticipated that. I chose for them, while my father had been president of the school board in southwestern Indiana. This was after his term as president of the school board, is that there really weren't a lot of choices in Evansville. The public schools were suffering. I didn't want them to go to a private exclusive day school, so they ended up going to Catholic schools.
Wow.
And so they had a very heavy dose of good academic training and learning, as well as understanding the Catholic religion. And I think that quite frankly served them well by seeing a spectrum of friends, which they have to this day, who they went to school with at Holy Rosary in Evansville, Indiana. It was interesting that after that anti-Semitic incident between a student and my son, is that my wife was asked to basically do Passover and Hanukkah at a Catholic school, which obviously broadened their students' experience because living in Evansville, no one quite knew what a Jew was or what a Jew wasn't. We were kind of a rare commodity, so to speak. So I think it worked well, not only for us, okay, for the Woll family, but it worked well for the Catholic and greater Protestant community in a lot of different ways. I just saw a friend of mine's wife was just received an award from the Junior League. My wife, and she happens to be Black, a person of color. My wife was the first Jew to be asked and accepted to the Junior League. At that point in time, Junior League was a very exclusive organization.
Yeah.
And this goes back 40, 50, almost 40, 50 years ago. Fortunately, things have changed since then.
Yeah, that's good. So you said that like other Jewish people in your community you think resented your family. Do you think it's because your family was involved in business that you were kind of accepted in the community, or was it just a personality thing that you kind of?
Oh gosh, that's hard to tell. That's hard to tell.
Yeah.
I am much more aggressive in my personality than my father was. Okay.
Yeah.
And aggression is a trait that some people don't find to be attractive. My family was very affluent. Most of the Jewish families, with a few exceptions of some families in Evansville, were not affluent. But we were accepted for all the wrong reasons in Evansville, which I find amusing. I remember my father relating he was president of the Evansville Philharmonic Board.
Okay.
At that point in time, they had a ball, which was not unusual. It was a Christmas ball. And each year, as president, he received an invitation to attend the Christmas ball of the Evansville Philharmonic Orchestra. And each year he asked, are there any other Jewish couples who were invited? The answer was no. And he subsequently never accepted during his term as the president of the Evansville Philharmonic, never accepted the invitation to go to the ball. Fortunately, all that has changed as well. But I basically have retained those memories, which obviously my children may not in fact be aware of, or certainly didn't experience.
There has been a shift where there's not as much of an anti-Semitic attitude today as there was when you were growing up.
I still think anti-Semitism is strong and it's increasing.
All right.
I think it's more subtle.
Okay, that makes sense.
It is more subtle. You have to see. One of the schools I was accepted to in New York at Columbia was social work, and you have to look at not necessarily verbal communication, but nonverbal communication, and you can frankly pick that up. Anti-Semitism is as bad as it's ever been, and it's increasing. But it's subtle. It's different than the anti-Semitism of the 20th century, but it sustains itself. And there's forces which I don't frankly want to or will describe at the national level in Washington, which basically has inflamed anti-Semitism and just general intolerance of all races and religions and ethnic backgrounds. We were a melting pot at one point in time in this country's history. We're no longer that melting pot. Basically, we find that we're exclusive. We are ghettoized, whether you're Jewish, Black, Chinese, and this country, unfortunately, has become just a series of geographical enclaves which divides us. It doesn't bring us together. It divides us in a lot of ways. Had I ever thought that Washington, the capital, would have been besieged, I would never have thought that would ever be the case, and it was. And unfortunately, I see more. I'm very pessimistic about the future of this country, and see more of those kinds of events in the future, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is concerning. You said there were 5 synagogues and temples in Evansville when you first moved there?
No, there were less than that. If
Okay.
I remember, there were 2.
Okay, 2.
I'm
not sure where I got that other number then.
Yeah, and there may have been less than 5. There may have been 3 or 4. There was a large population. If you look at the demographics of Evansville, it's on the Ohio River, and you had a lot of Jewish merchants that plied their trade along the Ohio River. It was a good navigational means by which to travel. At the time that I was raised in Evansville, there were 2 congregations, one Reformed, and then the other was conservative. And typically the Reformed were primarily German Jews who looked down at the Ashkenazi Jews who were at the conservative / Orthodox synagogue. So there was not necessarily discrimination, but there at the time, but there was the attitude that we're better than the others, and that was pervasive between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews all over the world, including Evansville, Indiana. Yeah. Evansville, Indiana was just a mirror of what had occurred internationally. If you remember, millions of Jews died who were Reformed and thought it couldn't happen there. It happened there. And now I agree. I think it can happen anywhere, including the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not a very optimistic note, but one which I have
Yeah.
going forward.
Yeah, you have to be aware and realistic.
Exactly. Exactly. There was, if you look, the number, I think it was down last year, but the year before, the number of anti-Semitic incidences that's recorded by the Anti-Defamation League increases. Okay. Part of that was the presidency of the United States. Part of that was the pandemic. Part of that was just economic circumstances of people and traditional scapegoating.
So you live in Carmel now.
I happen to live in Carmel now.
Okay.
Yes.
And you mentioned there were 2 trips back to Evansville. Has that been recent since you moved to Carmel?
No, I meant in terms of my life.
Oh, okay.
I moved. I went to school in St. Louis at Washington University.
Oh, okay.
And then I went to Columbia University. I was interested in architecture and historic preservation and urban policy. And then my mentor, who ran for lieutenant governor, brought me to Indianapolis. And rather than pursue a PhD program at New York University, I chose to come back to Indianapolis. And I was here from 72 to 80. And then my mother had developed lung cancer.
And that's why you
And I
moved back to
finished
Evansville.
law school. And so I went down to Evansville for my trip there with one son and my wife. And we were there for about 10, 15 years. And then we came back to Indianapolis, where she was raised. And we've lived in Indianapolis now for some 20 years.
Oh, okay. Been there quite a while.
Yeah, yes, quite a while.
How does the Indianapolis Jewish community compare to Evansville?
Interesting. Number one, it's far more affluent. If you look at the Jewish families and their contribution to the civic good of Indianapolis, it's far disproportionate. It's larger than the non-Jewish families. If you look at the Simons, the Glicks, the Ephraimsons, and so forth, I can go down that list. They have just made major contributions to the betterment of the community, of the greater Indianapolis community. Without them, a lot of stuff would not have happened at all. Okay, I'm aware of that. What I've seen in Indianapolis, not to step on anyone's toes, is that the Jewish titans of 20th century are gone. And there's no one, frankly, and I'll probably hear this from someone if this gets wide circulation, which hopefully it won't, is that all the Jewish titans that I had the opportunity and was fortunate to meet are now gone. And I just don't see that new generation taking the kind of leadership that their fathers and their grandfathers took in terms of the community.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's interesting to hear you say that about Indianapolis, because I've heard that here in Lafayette as well. I've spoken to some individuals that have said the same about our community, that this next generation isn't as invested in leadership as they feel like their generation was.
I'm not sure. Yeah, that's interesting because I'm not familiar with the Lafayette community, and I'm not sure what the causes or symptoms are.
Yeah.
Why is that case? There are some members of the Jewish community that are still quite active at the art museum or on the Philharmonic, but those numbers are very, very small. Okay, they're very small, and I'm not sure why. And it's really it's unfortunate that that's a case because there's less enrichment of the Indianapolis community than there has been, in the past. It's been, I don't know whether it's been a forced withdrawal. I don't think so. I think it's just been a natural withdrawal. I think interests of not my contemporaries, I'm talking about Jewish contemporaries who are in their 30s and 40s, just have no interest in that kind of civic participation or involvement that their fathers and grandfathers had. And I'm not sure, I really haven't given any thought as to really why that's the case, but it is. I can go through the boards, various civic boards in Indianapolis, and the number of people who are Jewish who sit on those boards are minuscule now.
An interesting development that would be good to look into.
Yeah.
Figure out what's going on as a trend there, it seems like.
And I'm not even sure whether it's a national trend or not.
Yeah.
I tend to think it isn't.
Yeah.
But I could be wrong on that.
It's worth noting, worth looking into.
Yes.
As a broader statement, as a Jewish individual in Indiana, what's like your overall opinion of that experience, your life experience as a Jewish individual in Indiana?
Mixed.
All right.
Mixed. There were lots of opportunities in Evansville. There are opportunities in Indianapolis. Certainly, there were very few political opportunities being Jewish unless you were Democrat and not a Republican, a liberal Republican like I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s. Okay, that was a major drawback in terms of any progress that a Jew could make, either in state or using Indiana as a launch board in national politics.
Wow.
In terms of other things, I find that in Indianapolis is, the native Jewish population is ghettoized. Those families who have raised, I've seen this time and time again. I'm still somewhat of an outsider, interestingly enough, and I've been in Indianapolis 20 years. What's the indication is I will run into someone who I haven't seen in a while, and they said, "Oh, do you still live in Evansville?" And I never understood how to take that.
Yeah.
I said, "Well, I've been here for 20 years, but what I've found about Indianapolis Jews is they're very insular.
Okay.
They don't reach out.
Yeah.
They don't grasp, and they're very happy with where they are and what they're doing."
Very interesting.
But that's the nature of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Because one time, I remember I was a candidate to be basically the Greater Indianapolis Jewish Federation was developing new leadership, and I was at the time 20. And it came to me from someone, it was very clear, is that we don't want to make an investment in you, David Woll, because you're not going to stay in Indianapolis. You're going to move somewhere. I happen to find that very short-sighted.
Yeah.
And what I've done, and I did move somewhere. I moved back to Evansville, and then came back here to Indianapolis, and lived here 20 years. On the part of the professional or lay staff of the Jewish Federation, that was a very short-sighted decision.
Yeah. Wow.
But I think it's reflective of the Jewish community where it was and where it still is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's having that perspective of where people, the way decisions are being made.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. No question about it. And then the other thing I've seen is with a major congregation in the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation. And we got to talk about Murray Saltzman.
Right.
Murray was my, are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
All right. Murray Saltzman was my rabbi,
All right.
small r. Murray, at the end of his life, towards the end of his life, became the rabbi of the oldest congregation in the United States in Baltimore.
Okay.
But Murray was at the time rabbi of the Indianapolis Hebrew congregation. And he was also marched with, he was very active in civil rights. He was an appointee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission by Richard Nixon, of all people.
Wow.
And Murray marched with Martin Luther King and others during the protests
My goodness.
in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. He was what I would have wanted to be if I had been a rabbi.
Wow.
And since Murray's been gone, there's been some very good rabbis. But what I've seen is in the Jewish community, and maybe because I'm quote a foreigner, is I've seen a disintegration of congregations. So whereas you may have had 2 or 3 or 4 congregations in the community, basically you've seen a breakup of Jewish congregations in Indianapolis. You've also seen obviously a dispersion of Jews from central Marion County. I think 43 or 45% of Jews now live in Hamilton County or Carmel or both. But you've seen a disintegration of congregations, and I think that may be maybe that's just a natural trend of congregations. I don't know. I don't have those kinds of demographics at my fingertips, but I've seen a lot of fragmentation particularly in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Interesting to track dispersion like that.
Yeah, if you have a chance, the Greater Indianapolis Jewish Federation spent a lot of money and had a report done, and it's online. Very, very interesting. It was an expensive report, and I understand the demographics because I used to work in that area when I was assistant director of the state planning agency. So I was always looking at census data and so forth. And they did a very good job of describing the Jewish community. And it was released, I think, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I would draw that to your attention. Go to the Jewish Federation.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and look at it. It's about 200 pages. It's very, very thorough, very interesting.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely take a look at that. All right. Well, you have given me a lot of perspective, and I think a lot of people will find this very useful to hear your observations and opinions on the Jewish communities of Evansville and Indianapolis and your experience in Indiana.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Emma.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You are welcome, and I wish you well. If I can help you in the future, let me know.
All right.